The room pulsed with noise. 1,000 flashbulbs firing in rapid succession, each one freezing a moment of political theater. The stage lights hit gold and red, glinting off a podium etched with a single name that had come to define chaos and charisma: Trump. He leaned forward, chin lifted, eyes glimmering with that familiar mix of pride and provocation. The crowd below was electric, restless, hungry for spectacle. He gave it to them. "Folks," he said, drawing the word out like a smirk, "we're undoing his mess, all of it." The words detonated. Laughter surged through the arena like a current. Supporters whooped, clapped, pointed. Some stood, others waved their red caps like flags of conquest. On screens across America, headlines began to flicker. "Trump slams Obama, again." A camera zoomed in, catching the curve of his grin, a portrait of self-satisfaction. Reporters murmured into microphones, voices overlapping like static. Another jab at his predecessor, a direct swipe at Obama's legacy. The microphones popped, the crowd roared, the spectacle was alive. And somewhere in the noise, in the echo of arrogance bouncing through living rooms, bars, and boardrooms, a quiet discomfort began to settle. Because beneath the cheers, beneath the performance, was a darker truth. This wasn't politics anymore. It was humiliation as strategy. Trump thrived in it. Every insult was a weapon. Every sneer, a show of dominance. To erase a man, you first mock his memory. But Obama remained unseen, just a presence felt in the spaces between applause. His name, now turned into a punchline, still carried weight. In the silence after the laughter, you could almost hear his calm voice echoing from the past. Steady, unbothered, reminding people what leadership used to sound like. Reporters exchanged glances. Pundits called it bold. Others called it cruel. But everyone agreed. Something had shifted. Trump stood tall, soaking in the adoration, convinced he had buried his rival for good. He didn't realize that in mocking the man, he was awakening the myth. Because what Trump didn't know was that the man he mocked was already planning the most graceful counterpunch in modern history. The stage lights dimmed, but the real performance had only just begun. In Washington, signatures replaced speeches. Pens sliced through history with the ease of ink. Cameras captured it all. One executive order after another, stacked high like trophies of undoing. The Paris Climate Accord, gone. Healthcare protections rolled back. Diplomatic bridges, torched in broad daylight. Each stroke of Trump's pen was deliberate, theatrical. Behind him, advisors clapped, cameras flashed, and headlines screamed, "Trump reverses Obama-era policies." The crowd that once roared at rallies now watched from home, eyes gleaming with vindication. "He's fixing it," they said. "He's undoing the damage." But to millions of others, it felt like a slow-motion demolition, not of laws, but of values. Television screens filled with split images. Polar ice caps melting as the U.S. withdrew from global commitments. Families staring at healthcare bills they could no longer afford. Foreign leaders shaking their heads in disbelief as diplomacy gave way to bravado. The media called it revenge politics. Historians warned of legacy erasure. But for everyday Americans who had once felt seen, heard, and represented, it felt deeply personal, like watching hope itself being legislated away. Barbershops in Chicago fell silent as TV anchors listed off the repeals. College students who once volunteered on Obama's campaign scrolled through headlines, disbelief hardening into sadness. Immigrant families, who had seen in him a reflection of belonging, whispered to each other at dinner tables. Why does he hate everything he built? Every speech, every order, every taunt seemed to carry the same subtext. Erase him. Erase the man. Erase the meaning. Erase the story that said dignity could lead nations. And yet, for all the noise, there was something hollow in it. Because Trump's crusade against Obama wasn't about policy. It was about pride. His need to dominate history had become a mirror of his own insecurity. Each dismantled program was less a solution, more a statement. There can only be one face on the wall. News panels debated endlessly. Was it ideological or personal? But to those who felt the loss, it didn't matter. It was personal now. A young woman in Detroit who once canvassed for hope and change looked up from her phone, tears welling as she watched a late-night monologue. He's not just undoing progress. He's trying to erase proof that progress was possible. The camera panned over protests, signs lifted under gray skies, faces weary but resolute. "Legacy lives on," they read. "You can't erase dignity." Still, the hits kept coming. Environmental safeguards gutted, education grants slashed, international partnerships abandoned. And every time, Trump smiled wider, like a man convinced that destruction was proof of greatness. But even empires built on ego eventually faced their reflection. Somewhere far from the headlines, another kind of power stirred, quiet, patient, deliberate. The kind that doesn't shout back but waits for the right moment to speak truth into chaos. Because while one man tried to erase a name from history, another was quietly writing his next chapter. The lights hit him first. Red, blinding, theatrical. Trump stood center stage, the crowd roaring his name like a chant at a Roman Colosseum. He stretched his arms wide, chin raised, basking in the kind of devotion that felt like oxygen. Cameras flashed, hats waved, flags blurred into motion. This wasn't politics. It was performance. And at the heart of it all stood a man who had spent his life chasing the reflection in his own mirror. Behind the smirk, behind the sharp tongue and exaggerated gestures, there was something else. A hunger. Not for leadership, but for domination. The kind that demands to be seen, to be worshipped, to be remembered. The kind that can't stand to share the stage with another name, especially one that history already loved. Obama's ghost haunted him. Not the man himself, but what he represented. Composure, intellect, grace under pressure. Every time Trump looked into the mirror, he saw not his success, but the shadow of a legacy that refused to fade. And that shadow infuriated him. So he made a vow, unspoken yet burning. Erase it, all of it. Not just the policies, but the pride, the memory, the myth of decency that came before. His rallies became confessionals for that obsession. "We're taking back our country," he shouted, his voice swelling through the speakers like thunder. "We're undoing the mess he left." The crowd erupted. The applause washed over him like a drug. Each cheer, each laugh, each "lock him up" filled the emptiness he could never admit existed. In those moments, he wasn't just the president. He was the avenger of resentment, the embodiment of every grievance that festered in America's underbelly. The stage glowed gold, the podium shimmered, and mirrors lined his world, from the marble halls of his hotels to the gleaming sheen of his private jet. He surrounded himself with reflections of victory, yet none of them could quiet the whisper in his head. He did it first. He did it better. Behind closed doors, aides learned to read his moods by the headlines. If Obama's name trended, tempers flared. If a journalist mentioned his predecessor's calm leadership, Trump lashed out with tweets before dawn, caps-locked fury disguised as confidence. His fear wasn't of failure. It was of being forgotten. Because to Trump, obscurity was death. Legacy wasn't about impact. It was about imprint. He didn't want to be remembered for what he built, but for what he conquered. That's why every action, every insult, every rollback, every televised jab was more than policy. It was a ritual of erasure. To undo Obama was to prove supremacy. To humiliate him was to rewrite history. To erase his name was to validate his own. But power built on resentment is like fire without oxygen. It burns bright, then eats itself alive. The more he tried to prove dominance, the more fragile it became. Behind the golden glass, there were cracks. Late nights spent scrolling through coverage, replaying applause that already felt too faint. Moments of silence he couldn't stand, because in silence, doubt lives. He filled that silence with noise, rallies, interviews, tweets, applause. The performance had to go on because the moment it stopped, reality would catch up. Reality that Obama didn't need a crowd to be relevant. He didn't need a stage to matter. And that truth was unbearable. Trump's greatest fear wasn't losing an election. It was losing the narrative. The story that said he was the hero, not the reaction. He wanted to be remembered as the man who fixed everything, even if it meant breaking it first. Yet history has a cruel sense of irony. The harder he tried to bury his predecessor, the more vivid that predecessor's legacy became. Each insult sparked reflection. Each rollback sparked remembrance. Each mockery reminded people of the dignity that once stood where spectacle now ruled. The applause still thundered, but it was starting to sound hollow, like echoes bouncing through a palace built on ego. And in the quiet between chants, a truth began to form, one that no gold stage or loyal crowd could drown out. Every empire built on ego faces the same moment, when silence becomes its loudest enemy. The storm had passed, at least on the surface. The headlines no longer screamed his name. The cameras that once chased every move had found new obsessions. For many, Barack Obama had vanished, a relic of a quieter, steadier time. But silence for him was never surrender. It was strategy. While Trump filled the airwaves with bluster and outrage, Obama disappeared into something deeper, the slow work of rebuilding from the ground up. No podiums, no parades, no spotlights, just quiet purpose. He began his mornings in a simple rhythm. Letters spread across his desk, a cup of coffee cooling beside him, sunlight spilling through the blinds of his home office. The handwriting varied. Children, immigrants, teachers, soldiers. You gave me hope. How do we fix this? Does decency still matter? He read every one. Sometimes he smiled. Sometimes his brow furrowed. Each line was a reminder that legacy isn't ink on paper. It's the echo left in people's hearts. He would jot notes in the margins of printed reports, sketching ideas for programs, foundations, youth initiatives. Not for power, but for continuity. We teach them to lead, he'd say to Michelle. That's how we make the noise fade, with a generation that knows better. The Obama Foundation became his stage, but this one was built not of applause, but of aspiration. Town halls replaced rallies. Classrooms replaced crowds. He stood before young activists in Chicago, Johannesburg, Kuala Lumpur, listening more than speaking. You don't fight hate with more hate, he told them softly. You outlast it. You outwork it. You outgrow it. Every word carried weight, not because of volume, but because of conviction. His power was never in the shout. It was in the steadiness, the refusal to bend to chaos. Outside, the world spun faster, louder, crueler. Trump raged on screens. Cable news cut from one scandal to the next. And in the midst of the noise, Obama's absence became its own kind of presence. He didn't need to defend himself. The contrast did it for him. Pundits wondered aloud, where is he? Why won't he speak? But those who understood leadership recognized it instantly. He wasn't gone. He was rebuilding, one voice, one dream at a time. There were moments of reflection that felt almost cinematic. A lone figure walking through the quiet halls of his library in progress, running his fingers along models of what would soon become a monument not to him, but to the story of hope itself. Every brick, every exhibit, every planned page of that library said something Trump's slogans never could. History remembers builders, not breakers. In a world of tweets and tantrums, Obama's restraint became radical. His patience, revolutionary. He chose not to fight in the mud, but to plant seeds above it. And those seeds began to grow. Mentorship programs flourished. Grassroots organizers he had once inspired rose to run for office. Communities began invoking his name again, not in nostalgia, but as a compass. To the immigrant struggling to belong, To the young black student who wondered if dignity still had a place in politics. To the teacher who told their class, "We still believe." Obama became more than a memory. He became a mirror, a quiet reminder of what leadership looks like when it's rooted in empathy, not ego. Behind the scenes, he watched the news like everyone else. Policies reversed, allies alienated, the moral compass spinning off its axis. But where others saw chaos, he saw cycles, history repeating its test. "This," he murmured to a close aide once, "is what we built them for, the next generation." Michelle would catch him staring out the window sometimes, reflective, not broken. "You miss it?" she'd ask with a smile. He'd chuckle softly. "I miss what it could still be." He never tweeted a rebuttal, never launched a public feud, but his silence began to speak louder than Trump's speeches. In the digital storm of outrage, his absence became a kind of moral gravity. The louder the insults grew, the more his calm seemed like defiance. And as time passed, something shifted. The crowds that once laughed at mockery started to tire of the noise. The same networks that amplified chaos began longing for composure. People started asking not what he would say, but when he would say it. He had become the quiet in the middle of America's storm. The contrast between arrogance and grace, between shouting and substance, between the man who demanded attention and the man who earned it. Obama's patience wasn't weakness. It was faith in the arc of progress, in the endurance of truth. He knew history had longer legs than outrage. And when he finally decided to speak, it wouldn't be to reclaim his legacy. It would be to remind the world what it means to have one. Years of silence had built pressure, not absence. His words had become currency, saved for the moment they would matter most. And when that moment came, when he finally stepped before a crowd once more, microphones trembling, cameras ready, millions watching, it wasn't about a comeback. It was about clarity. He took a breath, looked out across the faces that still believed, and spoke with the same quiet conviction that had once moved a nation. And then, after years of silence, he spoke, and the world leaned in. The air was electric before he even spoke. Cameras blinked like restless fireflies, microphones pointed toward the podium as if they could sense what was coming. It had been years since Barack Obama addressed a crowd like this, a hall packed with graduates, journalists, and world leaders. But when he walked on stage, the noise softened into reverent quiet. He didn't rush, he never did. The world had been waiting, holding its breath, wondering if the man they once called the calm in the storm still had that same quiet force. He looked out over the crowd, not with bitterness, not with nostalgia, but with that familiar steadiness. And then, in that voice that could disarm fury and inspire unity in the same breath, he began. "Here's the thing about truth," he said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "Reality has a way of catching up with those who deny it." It was a single line. No names, no direct attacks. But everyone knew exactly who he was talking about. The audience froze for a heartbeat, then erupted. Laughter, applause, cheers echoing through the hall like thunder rolling through a valley. Across the country, screens lit up. Newsrooms buzzed. One anchor whispered, "He said it," without saying it. Twitter exploded with hashtags. #Obama returns, #reality catches up, #calm vs chaos. Obama didn't bask in the reaction. He pressed on, his words measured but sharp. "Leadership," he continued, "isn't about tearing down what others have built just to prove you can. It's about building something worth leaving behind." The crowd rose again, as if standing wasn't a choice but an instinct. This was no comeback speech. This was a reckoning cloaked in grace. Every sentence carried precision. A surgeon, not a brawler. He didn't rant, he reasoned. He didn't boast, he taught. And with every phrase, he redrew the contrast the world had been feeling but couldn't articulate. The loudness of ego against the quiet of purpose. "Character," he said, "isn't tested when things are easy. It's tested when your name isn't in the headlines. When you do the work anyway." It wasn't just a rebuke. It was a reflection. Every line was both mirror and message. Somewhere in the White House, or maybe at a golf course, Trump watched the clip play on loop. Advisors shifted nervously. "Don't respond," one muttered. But he couldn't help himself. The next morning, the tweets came. Angry, defensive, incoherent. Obama? Silent. As if he'd already anticipated the reaction. As if every outburst only proved his point. The media framed it as the clash of eras. One headline read, "Obama returns with words sharper than any tweet." Another, "No names, no rage, just reality." What Obama delivered that night wasn't vengeance. It was restoration, the calm reasserting itself over chaos. His words reminded people of something they'd almost forgotten, that politics could still sound like dignity, that conviction could still live without cruelty. He closed with a message that didn't need translation. If we spend our time trying to erase one another, we forget who we are. America is not defined by the loudest voice in the room, but by the ones who listen and then act. The audience stood again, not roaring this time, but applauding in that kind of deep emotional rhythm that said thank you. Cameras flashed. Students wiped their eyes. Outside the hall, reporters scrambled for reactions. Pundits filled airwaves. Social feeds overflowed. But for a moment, just a moment, it felt like the noise had been silenced, because truth had finally spoken again. And this time, it didn't need volume. It just needed presence. Obama stepped away from the podium, his expression unchanged. Calm, reflective, complete. He didn't glance back. He didn't wave for attention. He simply walked off stage, leaving the echo of his words hanging like the final note of a song that refused to fade. The world had asked for a response. What it got was a masterclass. But what came next wasn't just a speech, it was a dismantling. The air that followed Obama's first speech was thick with something unfamiliar. Silence, not emptiness. It was the kind of silence that follows revelation, when the world collectively realizes it's just witnessed something larger than politics. Cameras replayed the moment in slow motion. His pauses, his glances, the way his words landed like soft stones reshaping a river. For days, clips circulated everywhere. Phones, feeds, dinner tables. One journalist called it a political solar eclipse, rare, blinding, impossible to look away from. Obama hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't named names, and yet every sentence had a target. "Power doesn't test character," he'd said. "It reveals it." That line alone replayed on every major network, spliced between shots of Trump's late-night tweets and angry podium rants. The contrast was cinematic. One man breathing chaos, the other radiating calm. At rallies, Trump sneered. "He thinks he's better than me," he barked, fists slamming the air. "We're fixing his disasters, folks." The crowd cheered, but something in the rhythm had shifted. The laughter wasn't as thunderous, the loyalty not as certain. Because while Trump shouted at his reflection, Obama spoke to something deeper, something people had forgotten they missed. Stillness. That week, Obama appeared at another event, smaller this time, a leadership forum with young activists. The setting was intimate, no grand stage, just a circle of voices eager to listen. Cameras rolled anyway. "We can't build by tearing down," he said softly, hands clasped. "We can't call something broken and walk away from it. Progress isn't about undoing what came before. It's about adding your brick to the foundation." The room nodded. The internet ignited. Commentators described it as the speech that redefined restraint. Hashtags like #TheBrickSpeech trended across platforms. Even some conservative columnists, grudgingly, almost resentfully, called it impossible not to respect. Meanwhile, Trump's thumbs flew across his phone. "Fake leader, pathetic, Obama speaks but does nothing. No one is watching." Each tweet landed like a shout into the void. But this time, the void didn't echo back. Obama never responded. Not once. And that silence became its own kind of power. the power to unmask desperation. The media treated it like a duel, but it wasn't one. It was a mirror, showing two men, two legacies, two completely different understandings of strength. One sought applause, the other inspired reflection. Late-night hosts dissected it. "Obama's playing chess," one joked. "Trump's still yelling at the board." Laughter followed, but beneath it was truth, a shift in tone, a quiet moral realignment. Across the world, leaders weighed in. A European diplomat tweeted, "Dignity has re-entered the conversation." A Canadian broadcaster called it the most American thing we've seen in years. Humility with backbone. Even inside Washington, whispers grew. Former staffers, journalists, even some within Trump's circle admitted privately, he can't compete with that. Because while Trump chased headlines, Obama was shaping history again. This time not from the Oval Office, but from the echo chamber of conscience. Footage of his words filled news montages, him speaking about empathy, integrity, legacy. His tone calm, his posture unshakable. Each appearance felt less like a comeback and more like a reckoning. And then came the moment, the line that would become legend. Standing before a crowd of students, Obama leaned on the podium, his voice steady as glass. "You can erase policies," he said. "You can erase programs, but you can't erase the people who believed in them." The audience fell silent. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Then came the roar, an eruption of applause, tears, and chants. Outside, it was chaos again. Reporters running, pundits analyzing, social feeds melting under the weight of sound bites. But inside that hall, it was still. It felt sacred. In living rooms across America, people whispered, "That's our president." It wasn't nostalgia. It was recognition. That leadership could be both firm and kind, powerful without cruelty. Within hours, the line became a movement. T-shirts, murals, tweets, documentaries. The caption under every clip read, "You can't erase the people." Trump's reaction came swiftly. Another flurry of tweets, angrier than ever. "Obama is all talk, no results, fake hero, fake legacy." But even his own base had grown tired. The noise no longer inspired fury, it invited fatigue. The more he raged, the smaller he seemed. Meanwhile, Obama's silence thundered across continents. His restraint became a symbol of moral precision, the art of choosing when not to fight. Every commentator said it in their own way. He didn't win by arguing, he won by outlasting. At a cafe in Atlanta, two strangers debated it. One said he should have gone harder. The other shook his head. He didn't need to. He already proved his point. And that was the truth of the moment. Obama's greatest counterattack wasn't a speech. It was what came after. The calm refusal to engage in noise. The more Trump tried to provoke him, the more obvious the imbalance became. One man craved reaction. The other commanded reflection. Soon, late-night sketches turned from mockery to meaning. Documentaries replayed Obama's lines with cinematic music underneath. Students quoted his words in classrooms. Churches echoed his message in sermons. And somewhere, in the noise of politics, a nation began to remember something it had forgotten. The sound of grace. Obama never said, "I told you so." He didn't have to, because the country said it for him. In every like, every share, every whispered conversation about what leadership used to feel like. By the time the applause faded, Trump's rage had burned itself out. The spectacle couldn't compete with sincerity. The cameras caught Obama leaving one last stage, head slightly bowed, hands folded, not in victory, but in peace. Reporters shouted questions. He smiled politely, offered a nod, and walked away into the sunset light. The last frame of the broadcast froze on that image. One man, unbothered, untouchable, walking into legacy. And as the applause thundered, something shifted, not just in politics, but in the nation's memory. It started with a clip, just 47 seconds long. Obama's face, The calm half-smile, the line that had already begun to echo across the nation. You can erase policies, but you can't erase the people who believed in them. Within hours, it was everywhere. On TikTok, creators stitched the moment with tears in their eyes. On Instagram, teachers shared it under classroom selfies. On Twitter, journalists called it the speech that reset the moral temperature of America. Cable news ran it on repeat, every network choosing their own dramatic headline. The calm before the comeback. Obama outclasses chaos. Legacy restored. Late-night hosts turned the moment into legend. One leaned forward in mock awe, saying, "That wasn't a clapback, that was a symphony." Another said, "He didn't drag him, he educated him." The crowd howled, the nation watched. But beneath the laughter, something deeper pulsed. Relief. For millions, Obama's words were more than a rebuttal. They were a reminder of who America once aspired to be. Republicans scoffed, calling it performative nostalgia. Pundits accused him of moral grandstanding. Yet their outrage sounded hollow, rehearsed, as if even they could feel the air shifting. Because while politicians argued, the people reacted. Teachers quoted his lines at morning assemblies. Pastors wove them into sermons. A high school student in Texas posted a video titled, "My President Taught Me Dignity." It reached 2 million views overnight. At protests, signs began to appear with simple words. "You can't erase us." The message had evolved beyond Obama. It had become communal, living, bigger than politics. It wasn't about red or blue anymore. It was about the quiet, collective exhale of a country rediscovering its voice. Journalists began to rewrite the narrative. He didn't defend his legacy, one historian wrote in The Atlantic. He redefined it, from policy to principle, from politics to purpose. The ripple widened. Late-night panels debated whether this was the start of a post-outrage era. College campuses hosted Obama Nights, screenings of his old speeches paired with discussions on civic decency. A new generation that had grown up in chaos began to find its compass again. Even some of Trump's former voters admitted something had changed. In interviews, they hesitated before speaking. One said, "I didn't like Obama before, but that was class." It wasn't just admiration, it was a recalibration. People were tired of shouting, tired of fear, tired of politics that mocked rather than inspired. Obama hadn't promised to fix that. He simply embodied what fixing it might look like. In one viral podcast clip, a host summed it up perfectly. Trump yells to be heard, Obama pauses, and the world listens. The markets didn't shift. No policies changed overnight. But something more subtle did, an invisible current in the culture. It was as if, for a brief moment, America remembered how to breathe. The imagery spread like poetry. Murals appeared on city walls, Obama's silhouette above the words, "Integrity endures." A filmmaker turned his speech into a short cinematic montage, scored with piano and rising strings. Within a week, it had 50 million views. Meanwhile, Trump's counterattacks grew more erratic. Late-night rants, desperate claims of irrelevance. Yet each attempt only magnified the contrast. Rage versus reason, noise versus nuance. Even the algorithms seemed to favor calm over chaos. For once, positivity went viral. It wasn't just about the man, it was about the meaning. Obama had reminded people that decency could still command attention, that restraint could be revolutionary. News anchors began calling it the dignity effect. Political scientists wrote papers about post-conflict leadership. But for everyday Americans, it was simpler. It just felt right again. In homes, parents showed their kids the speech, saying, "This is how you fight without hate." In classrooms, teachers replayed his words before exams. In churches, the message became a benediction. Let integrity be louder than insult. Even Obama seemed surprised by the magnitude of it all. In a private interview, he smiled modestly and said, "It's not about me. It's about us remembering who we are." And maybe that was the secret all along. He wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to restore a mirror. By the end of the week, his approval ratings had quietly surged to their highest since leaving office. But the numbers didn't matter. What mattered was the tone of the country. Softer, steadier, more reflective. Across screens, across generations, across divides, one truth resonated. The insult had faded, but the integrity remained. Historians began to say what many already felt, that this moment wasn't about revenge, but renewal. It wasn't about reclaiming power, but redefining it. And as the noise of politics resumed its endless churn, the echoes of that speech continued, in classrooms, sermons, conversations, and art. Because some moments don't end when the microphone turns off. They ripple long after. But in the echoes of victory, one truth remained. The real power was never the insult, but the integrity that survived it. The storm passes. The cameras quiet. The timelines slow. What remains isn't the shouting. It's the silence that follows, the kind that hums with something larger than politics. In that silence, dignity stands untouched. Obama's comeback was never about revenge. It wasn't a counterpunch meant to humiliate or a victory lap meant to taunt. It was restoration, of tone, of truth, of what leadership once meant. He didn't return to fight. He returned to remind. Remind a divided nation that power doesn't need to roar to be real. That legacy isn't measured in followers, but in footsteps, the quiet kind that lead others forward. The camera pans wider now, from the podium to the people. Students inspired, workers hopeful, parents whispering to their children. This is what respect looks like. The noise fades into something purer, gratitude. Because what Obama showed wasn't political brilliance, it was moral clarity. He taught that real leadership doesn't burn bridges for applause. It builds legacies for generations. That strength isn't in the insult, but in restraint. That greatness isn't claimed, it's earned, one act of grace at a time. Historians will write about policies and headlines, debates and polls. But the people, they'll remember the feeling, the stillness of his pause before a truth, the way he smiled, not to gloat, but to heal, the reassurance that dignity, though often dismissed, is undefeated. Across living rooms, the speech replayed not as a viral moment, but as a mirror. It reflected the version of America many had feared was lost, one built on empathy, courage, and quiet conviction. And in that reflection, a question began to echo. What kind of legacy do we leave when the noise stops? Because Obama's legacy wasn't written in executive orders or ceremonies. It was written in how people carried themselves afterward, in how young activists spoke with calm conviction, how divided neighbors found small ways to listen again, how kindness began to feel like strength, not softness. In a time when chaos was currency, he reminded the world that calm could still lead, that the loudest voice isn't always the truest, that integrity, once dismissed as weakness, is what survives when everything else falls apart. And that's the moral heartbeat of this story. Dignity isn't flashy. It doesn't trend for long, but it endures. Because when the speeches fade and the spotlight turns away, what's left isn't the performance, it's the principle. Obama once said, "We rise by lifting others." And in the end, that's what his comeback did. It lifted a weary country out of cynicism, if only for a moment, and reminded it how to hope again. It wasn't the destruction of an opponent. It was the quiet restoration of faith. That character still counts, that decency still matters, that the moral arc still bends, if not by force, then by example. True power doesn't shout, it listens. It lasts. And that's the difference between spectacle and service, between ego and empathy, between a name that trends and a name that teaches. Because legacies, the real kind, aren't built in the heat of applause. They're built in the patience of purpose, in the resilience of truth, in the simple human act of showing up with grace when it's easier to be cruel. And as the light breaks through the noise, the story comes full circle. The insult that was meant to erase instead immortalized. The nation moves on, but the message remains. Legacies aren't erased by ego. They're written in the hearts of people. The world remembers not the one who shouted, but the one who stood still and spoke with dignity. And as the noise fades, one truth endures. History never forgets who built, only who tried to destroy. Trump tried to humiliate Obama, but instead, he immortalized him. What began as an insult became a legend. The louder the mockery grew, the clearer the truth became. You cannot erase what was built on purpose, integrity, and hope. You can tear down walls, revoke policies, rewrite headlines, but you cannot dismantle the impact of leadership that touched hearts, not just history books. The screen softens. Obama stands before a crowd, smiling, not in victory, but in peace. The applause fades into sunlight spilling through clouds. The moment feels timeless, suspended between the noise of politics and the quiet of legacy. Because in that stillness, we see it. The real measure of greatness isn't how loud you speak, but how deeply you're remembered. Every generation faces this test. The temptation to destroy versus the courage to build. And time, without fail, always chooses the builders. So here's the message. Not just to those watching, but to anyone who's ever been doubted, dismissed, or disrespected. Don't answer insult with anger. Answer it with excellence. Don't fight to be louder. Fight to be lasting. Obama didn't need to shout back. His work spoke louder than any words could. And now his legacy stands not as a monument of power, but as a reminder of principle. History belongs to those who build. If you believe in that kind of legacy, in grace over grievance, in truth over noise, then share this story. Subscribe, stand tall, and help keep this message alive. Because every time we choose dignity over division, we write our own legacy, one worth remembering. And in the end, dignity always wins.